Interviewed by Christopher Lehman helped Nathaniel Rich King in Bangor, Maine, 1994. Stephen King began this interview in the summer of 2001, 2 years after he was struck by a minivan while walking near his home in Center Lovell, Maine. He was lucky to have survived the accident, in which he suffered scalp lacerations, a collapsed right lung, and multiple fractures of his right hip and leg. 6 pounds of metal that had been implanted in King's body during the initial surgery were removed shortly before the author spoke to the Paris Review, and he was still in constant pain. The orthopedist found all this infected tissue and outraged flesh, said King. The burses were sticking right out, like little eyes. The interview was held in Boston, where King, an avid Red Sox fan, had taken up temporary residence to watch his team make its pennant run. Although he was still frail, he was back to writing every day, and by night he would take his manuscript to Fenway Park so that he could edit between innings and during pitching changes. A second interview session with King was conducted early this year at his winter home in Florida, which happens to be within easy driving distance of the Red Sox's spring training compound in Fort Myers. The house lies at the end of a sandy key, and looks, by virtue of a high vaulted ceiling, something like an overturned sailboat. It was a hot, sunny morning and King sat on his front steps in blue jeans, white sneakers, and a Tabasco hot sauce t-shirt, reading the local newspaper. The day before, the same paper had printed his home address in its business section, and fans had been driving by all morning to get a peek at the world-famous author. "People forget," he said, "I'm a real person." King was born on September 21, 1947, in Portland, Maine. His father abandoned his family when King was very young, and his mother moved around the country before settling back in Maine, this time in the small inland town of Durham. King's first published story, I Was a Teenage Grave Robber, appeared in 1965 in a fan magazine called Comics Review. Around that time he received a scholarship to attend the University of Maine in Orono, where he met his wife, Tabitha, a novelist with whom he has 3 children and to whom he is still married. For several years, he struggled to support his young family by washing motel linens at a laundry, teaching high school English, and occasionally selling short stories to men's magazines. And, in 1973, he sold his novel Carrie, which quickly became a bestseller. Since then, King has sold over 300 million books. In addition to 43 novels, King has written 8 collections of short stories, 11 screenplays, and 2 books on the craft of writing, and he is a co-author with Stuart Donan of Faithful, a day-by-day account of the Red Sox's 2004 championship season. Virtually all of his novels and most of his short stories have been adapted for film or television. Although he was dismissed by critics for much of his career, one New York Times review called King a writer of fairly engaging and preposterous claptrap. His writing has received greater recognition in recent years, and in 2003 he won the Medal for Distinguished Contribution to American Letters from the National Book Foundation. King has also been honored for his devoted efforts to support and promote the work of other authors. In 1997, he received the Writers for Writers Award from Poets. In person, King has a gracious, funny, sincere manner and speaks with great enthusiasm and candor. He is also a generous host. Halfway through the interview he served lunch, a roasted chicken, which he proceeded to hack it with a frighteningly sharp knife, potato salad, coleslaw, macaroni salad, and, for dessert, key lime pie. Asked what he was currently working on, he stood up and led the way to the beach that runs along his property. He explained that 2 other houses once stood at the end of the key. One of them collapsed during a storm 5 years earlier, and bits of wall, furniture, and personal effects still wash ashore at high tide. King is setting his next novel in the other house. It is still standing, though it is abandoned and, undoubtedly, haunted. Interviewer: How old were you when you started writing? Stephen King: Believe it or not, I was about 6 or 7, just copying panels out of comic books and then making up my own stories. I can remember being home from school with tonsillitis and writing stories in bed to pass the time. Film was also a major influence. I loved the movies from the start. I can remember my mother taking me to Radio City Music Hall to see Bambi. Whoa, the size of the place, and the forest fire in the movie, it made a big impression. So when I started to write, I had a tendency to write in images because that was all I knew at the time. Interviewer: When did you begin reading adult fiction? King: in 1959, probably, after we had moved back to Maine. I would have been 12, and I was going to this little one-room schoolhouse just up the street from my house. All the grades were in one room, and there was a shithouse out back, which stank. There was no library in town, but every week the state sent a big green van called the Bookmobile. You could get 3 books from the bookmobile and they didn't care which ones. You didn't have to take out kid books. Up until then, what I had been reading was Nancy Drew, the Hardy Boys, and things like that. The first books I picked out were these Ed McBain 87th Precinct novels. In the one I read first, the cops go up to question a woman in this tenement apartment and she is standing there in her slip. The cops tell her to put some clothes on, and she grabs her breast through her slip and squeezes it at them and says, "In your eye, cop." And I went, shit. Immediately something clicked in my head. I thought, that's real, that could